the fifth session. I think I have to say it again. So, hello everybody, good morning, and welcome back to the first session of the Kelsen conference. And we are really honored to have a keynote speaker, which is now friend of this conference, Monika Zalewska from the University of Lodz. Monika participated in the Kelsen conference a couple of months ago, and she's going to reintroduce her paper about fictionalism and Kelsen's general theory of norms. So Monika, thank you so much for being with us again, and looking forward to an excellent presentation and discussion.
Thank you, Jorge. Good afternoon. Today I'm going to talk about fictionalism in Hans Kelsen's general theory of norms. The problem of fictionalism occurred along with the question what happened to basic norm in general theory of norms. Because in final work, general theory of norms, Kelsen rejected the hypothetical character of the basic norm, and instead he claimed that the basic norm is self-contradictory fiction. So such formulation gives an impression that Kelsen rejected the concept of basic norm, indicating that this concept is only fictional. Hence, it does not agree with reality, but not only that, it's also self-contradictory. And if this is read straightforward, then it seems that basic norm is worthless concept for the purposes of legal science, because legal science does not seem to tolerate disagreement of the concept in question with reality, or the concept which is self-contradictory. And if so, then such rejection could be potentially destructive for entire pure theory. Kelsen would have troubles with sustaining is and ought separation, and some other categories which depend on normativity thesis, such as imputation, would also suffer. But fortunately, it can be said that Kelsen was under the influence of Hans Weininger's fictionalism, which gives us a hint how to interpret this fictional basic norm. So interpretation, the framework of Hans Weininger's can help us to restore this basic norm as a fiction, as a coherent concept. But of course, if someone rejects a philosophy of Hans Weininger, then of course would remain on this position that Kelsen damaged the basic norm. But I'm going to argue in favor of this interpretation, and I will look for value in Hans Weininger fictionalism along with this contemporary account on fictionalism which appear in recent years. Let's start then from Hans Weininger's fictionalism. Weininger made an observation that the scientific theories are in fact full of fictions, and he gave several examples. Actually, half of his book are examples of such case. Uniform movement, ether, Kant's categories a priori, to name the few. And all these concepts have this in common, that they do not exist in reality. However, they are useful by bringing something important to the knowledge, allowing it to move forward. And Hans Weininger summed this up saying that fictions are vehicles of thoughts. And for him, the most interesting fictions are proper fictions, which then were rather rejected by contemporary fictionalism, which disagree with reality and also are self-contradictory. But for the Kelsen, it was important distinction. So I will sustain it at least in the first part of the presentation. In fictionalism, the most important criterion is the criterion of utility. So because it's a fiction, because it does not agree with reality, this fiction must be justified. And the usage of this fiction is justified if the fiction contributes significantly, and it must be significant contribution, to the theory in which it is used. Also, there is prohibition of drawing too far-reaching consequences from the fiction. So maybe not all consequences, some of them might be still useful and fall under this criterion of utility, but we must be very careful with drawing consequences after introducing the fiction. For instance, if we start to ask about ontological status of the fiction is in question, probably that wouldn't make much sense because it's a fiction. Hence, we need to keep in mind that fiction serves only one purpose: to move scientific inquiry forward. Now, basic norm as a fiction, so what we can read from general theory of norms. In Weiningerian terms, basic norm is proper fiction, and Kelsen says this explicitly, that basic norm does not agree with reality and is also self-contradictory. And what does this self-contradictoriness mean? So it's the combination of definition of the norm, which Kelsen introduced in his last book, that the norm is the meaning of the act of will, and the fact that basic norm is a norm, so falls under this definition. As a norm, it requires an act of will above. And if there is act of will above, then the basic norm can't be basic. Then there is this question of utility of basic norm as a fiction, so justification of the existence in the framework of Kelsen's theory. And this utility seems to be very important, as all we know. It enables to understand the concept of validity in a normative framework, and also enables to grasp the normative aspect of law. Also, from this fictional nature of basic norm, one should not draw such consequences as, for instance, if the basic norm is fictional, therefore entire law or validity of norms is fictional. So this is probably what Weiningers meant, that we shouldn't draw too far-reaching consequences of the fiction. This is fiction, so some of the implication might be valuable, but the rest might bring us to paradoxes. And analyzing this, I ask myself question whether the basic norm is a standalone element, or perhaps it's a symptom of something else, of something larger. Well, in Kelsen, reading directly him, basic norm seems to be a standalone fictional element. However, I think it is a symptom, or it can be interpreted as a symptom of much broader fictional approach to legal science. And then it could be stated that Kelsen paved the way for fictionalism in his theory. In the next slide, I'm going to examine this possibility that and especially the modern fictionalism in general framework for general theory of norms. So let's maybe start from ontological fictionalism. So we move now from Weininger to contemporary fictionalism, and big part of it is ontological fictionalism. It concerns the problem of existence. It's the third way between nominalism and realism, and includes metaethical fictionalism. There are two main strategies of fictionalism. It's prefixing and prefacing. Prefixing states that the fiction, that in the fiction X, statement Y is true. For instance, according to Daniel Defoe's book, Robinson Crusoe lived on the deserted island. While prefacing is more of as-if conduct, this is activity which reminds of pretending that something was true. If we discuss adventures of Robinson Crusoe, we pretend that Robinson Crusoe existed. Well, and ontological fictionalism has rather complicated relationship with Weininger's account on fictions. They are not very enthusiastic about Weininger. So there is no special link to this fictionalism. This ontological fictionalism rather grew independently. There is also fictionalism in science, and this one stems from Weininger's account, some sort of rehabilitation of Weininger, because Weininger's fictionalism was rather considered as unsuccessful project for many years. And then in 90s, some legal scholars started to argue that actually it's a very good idea, which is worth to elaborate, and this happens until these days. Fictionalism in science focuses more on methodological issues. It addresses the inquiry how fictions in science work and how can they be useful. So it's less focused on fictional strategies like prefacing or prefixing, and its main goal is to understand the function of fictions, especially scientific models in science. Also, this type of fictionalism explains how and why the fictional model can contribute to the science. Now, Kelsen and contemporary fictionalism. So now I'll try to apply these two types of fictionalism into Hans Kelsen's thought in much more broad manner that he did in General Theory of Norms. First of all, I believe that Kelsen's theory can benefit from both types of fictionalism. The scientific account might explain Kelsen's approach to legal science in his final book, while ontological fictionalism might explain the mental activity of lawyer addressing the inquiry, how they think. I will start from fictionalism in legal science because it gives some broader framework. So if we get back to the inquiry, whether the basic norm is a standalone fictional element in general theory of norms, or rather a symptom of larger fictional picture, and if we commit to this suspicion that it is a symptom of larger picture, we might ask, how did Kelsen come to the conclusion about the existence of the basic norm? Well, we all know that the basic norm is a consequence of two separations done by Kelsen, which is of law and morality and is and ought. And because as a normativist, being unable to justify the validity of constitution through facts or more natural law doctrine, Kelsen had to introduce the normative category of the basic norm. So basic norm emerge as a consequence of two separation, and these separations can be interpreted as fictional to some extent. Let's start from the is and ought separation. Well, how to trace the fiction here? I started from the observation that law exists in society and only makes sense in society. Outside society, there is no law. And for every man, law, although distinct, is blended with any other social phenomena. This is, we could call it this child's point of view, that children have all things blended together. And for every man, also law is part of some reality. He probably, such person doesn't even identify it as social reality. This is something which surrounds him or her. So that's why the separation done by Kelsen for purposes of legal science is far artificial, because normally law is somewhere among many different social phenomena. But this separation is done exactly because law is distinct from other social facts. This separation is made for the purpose of cognition of law, to cognize law in its pure form, not contaminated by social fact, and to also understand the normative aspect of law. In this case, the lawyer thinks as if law did not exist in social context. So that's the fiction, that people think as if law was outside the social reality. And this fiction is done because if we want to learn the nature of law, see as it is, we need to think as if law was radically separated from fact and in every aspect. But then as soon as a lawyer sees the legal system separated from the fact, in the next step of his legal thinking, he can reconstruct the links between is and ought. Also treat then the basic norm as the Wittgenstein's ladder, he can reject it. So if we want to identify the strategy which lies behind, underlies this separation, this is prefacing. We act as if law was radically separated from facts, from social reality. There is possible misunderstanding, so I would like to make clear what I mean. Fictionality of such separation does not mean that law is a fact. The fiction of separation of is and ought is introduced exactly because the law is not a fact. It is normative phenomena, but the law is blended with other phenomena in social reality, and it is difficult to grasp all its aspects. And because it's difficult to grasp all its aspects when it's in social reality, we have to take it out from social reality to cognize it. So this fiction is needed to draw these normative aspects into the light, because normally law functions in the social world and is blended. We can compare this to other fields of science. In empirical science, in empirical science, it's very often that when something is examined under microscope, the sample must be pure. So this object, let's say bacteria, is taken out from its natural environment where it exists, and the sample of this bacteria is purified of anything else which was, let's say, in this water in which bacteria existed, just to examine this pure bacteria, pure sample. So here I believe it's exactly the same operation, just made on abstract object, not concrete one. So the fictional separation between is and ought does not mean a turn into positivistic thesis that law is a fact. On the contrary, we remain in normative sphere. The same can be said about the separation of law and morality. However, I believe here is a bit different strategy involved. So Kelsen's pure theory of law can be understood in terms of model, which is considered also as a fiction. So in fiction of science framework, there is a most important category of fictions, which are models. And I believe when it comes about separation from morality, we can perceive it as a model. So it represents the reality in the same manner as map of Vienna represents the city of Vienna. Well, today I have a pleasure to be in city of Vienna, so yeah, I can see the beauty of Vienna, but I cannot see the beauty of Vienna on the map of Vienna, because map of Vienna abstracts from many features. One of them is the beauty of the city, because this is not purpose of the map. Map doesn't have this purpose. Map has the purpose to orient ourselves in the city. So models do this. They abstract from less relevant features which do not conform to their purpose and highlight the other features which are most relevant. So we could say that pure theory is the representation of some concrete legal system, or can be representation of some concrete legal system. And pure theory abstracts from the problem of the content of law. So this is this beauty of Vienna would be here the analogy drawn to the content of law. We abstract from this because that's not the aim of pure theory to talk about content of law. And content of law can contain moral rules. So concrete legal system contains these several moral rules. It contains general clauses, and nobody denies this. I think also we can agree with heart of minimum natural law content. But the main of the model, especially this model of separation of law and morality, is to focus on one important aspect of the phenomena. And here, this phenomena is form of law. And we can cognize the form of law by eliminating irrelevant aspect of reality, which is content of law, where morality also has its place. Hence, we assume the fiction by purifying the law from alien elements such as morality. And at the same time, we do not deny their existence in reality, in the content of law from which Kelsen abstracts. But thanks to such separation, a law can be defined in objective terms. So the strategy here is also not only model, but also prefacing appears that we act as if law was radically separated from morality. Of course, here we can find possible misunderstanding. One could say, okay, with separation between law and morality is fictional, it means that law and morality are not separated. Of course, this is false. This conclusion cannot be drawn from what I said. The concept of law is not associated with morality, and for this reason, such fiction is justified, because its aim is to reflect some nature of law. This fiction is needed. And we need to act as if there were no relations between law and morality to cognize this form of law. Now, because there are some misunderstandings, I think they stem from the term fictional separation. I think this term might be misleading. Because it might suggest that law is not distinct from facts and morality if I say that it's a fiction. While it is exactly the opposite. These separations are done and can be done because law is distinct from phenomena. So I made another distinction, that distinction between ontological separation from methodological separation. And law is distinct phenomena and is separated from facts and morality ontologically. And this separation is not fictional. What's fictional is methodological separation. It is analogical to the conduct done in laboratory in order to make sure that sample examined is pure. So the conclusion is that it might be more correct to say that the purity of Kelsen's theory has fictional character. Now, let's move to some elements where the fictionalism is. First, I would like to go back to basic norm, which is the most interesting case. And I would like to also apply some contemporary account of connected with fictionalism, because before I just focus on Weininger's account. So general fictional framework leads to the notion of basic norm, and the basic norm became the most visible indication of fictionalism. That's what we know already. And the basic norm as fiction can be regarded in two fields in accordance with two main functions played by it. The validity, and this is something which Kelsen addressed in general theory of norms, and also legal science and cognition, and I would like to address it here. But let's start from basic norm and validity. So this inquiry concerning validity forced Kelsen to introduce basic norm, and Kelsen talks about the basic norm as fiction in Weiningerian sense. So the lawyers lead the notion of basic norm, assuming the validity of the legal system. And this is ontological fiction of prefacing. The basic norm here is implicit, so lawyers assume its existence to their practice, probably unconsciously, well, for sure unconsciously. And a fictional basic norm, which grants validity to legal system, does not mean that the validity of entire legal system is fictional. The fictionality of one element is not followed by the notion that the rest is fictional as well. Now, basic norm and legal science, that's the second aspect. In this aspect of legal science, the basic norm is the category which enables lawyer to regard certain system as normative or to regard certain normative system as legal one, which means lawyers act as if basic norm existed. So again, we have prefacing here. And by doing this, lawyer recognizes the legal system and acknowledges its existence. This, so on the level of pure theory, the basic norm is the fiction which enables the Kelsenists, people who work on Kelsen's theory, to understand how lawyers think, which means that basic norm is defined here explicitly. And this level involves fictionalism in science. Finally, the Stufenbau, I believe we also here have a fiction, namely Stufenbau can be regarded as a model. So Stufenbau is hierarchical structure of law which describes the relations between higher and lower norm and the organs issuing it. However, comparing it to real life process, especially in multi-centric legal world, it's perceived by some by too simplified or adequate. So some postulate to substitute with network model. But this hierarchical structure of law described by the staircase metaphor is a model of much more complex hierarchical relations between norms. And this model is very successful because not only it reflects very complex relationships between norms, organs, and empowerment. So it's kind of multidimensional, but also this model is exclusive only to law. So Stufenbau does not apply, for instance, to morality. And network model is unable to deliver so much understanding of the structure of law. So neither it is able to reflect complex relations between norms, nor it's exclusive to law. So to sum up, if we apply fictionalism to general theory of norms, there are some advantages and disadvantages. First of all, if we talk about advantages, Kelsen introduced this fictionalism through basic norms, and it turns out that fictionalism encompasses entire general theory of norms in two aspects: the methodology and as a landmark concepts of pure theory of law. And then fictionalism explains the meaning of separation between is and ought and law and morality for pure theory of law, indicating the exact field on which these separations should be considered and on what they should not. It also explains the absence of total accuracy in Kelsen's pure theory of law, for instance, in case of Stufenbau. Stufenbau does not need to reflect all relations. It can abstract, for example, from failure calcul because it's a model. So it's for the purpose to understand certain aspects, but not all aspects. And it justifies the presence of such categories as basic norm. Now, there are some problems. So there's always price to pay. And obviously, in this case, there is also price to pay. First of all, there is a broad category of fictions. And fictionalists contemporary put it that Weinigers saw fictions everywhere. So indeed, if we start to commit to fictionalism, we can extend this category very broadly, but I don't think it somehow eliminates it or make it worthless. it still enables us to understand certain aspect of the concept. Fictionalism in science is well described for empirical science, but much more less is said about fictionalism in social science. Social science is about abstract phenomena. So it is easy to build a model of concrete phenomena, but not abstract one. We can build a model of atom, we can draw a model of atom, even children can build a model of atom from papier-mâché. But we can't easily build a model of law because it's not concrete. We need some symbol, some representation of law. We cannot draw law itself. We could draw a paragraph as a symbol of law, but not law. So we need something which transmit this very abstract concept of law into something less abstract. And I believe metaphors could be here of help, like in case of Stufenbau. So we have a metaphor of staircase, metaphor of network. There are also metaphors of tree or pyramid. And I believe they can be understood as models. So this is the model of Stufenbau, staircase or network. While metaphor here plays the function of this papier-mâché, which children use to form the model of atom. Finally, also such objection is raised that this name is quite misleading. So for the scientific project, especially now when there are some anti-scientific movements, telling people that, oh, this is the fiction, it might be understood wrong. So maybe the name is not fortunate, but all in all, I believe it's a very valuable concept. Thank you for your attention.
Please join me in thanking Professor Zalewska. It was a wonderful presentation, and I'm sure it has generated many questions. I have a couple, but as Jorge has been announcing, we have about 25 minutes for questions. So first of all, Professor Phil Edwards.
Yeah, not a professor, I'm afraid. Yeah, I found that really interesting. I particularly like the use of fictionalism to operate that sort of double separation between is and ought and between law and morality. I thought that was really illuminating. I have one question, which is it's everything you said seemed to make a lot of sense in terms of the basic norm, in terms of clarifying the sort of classical period, Kelsen's idea of the presupposed basic norm. We proceed as if the basic norm was valid and everything follows from there. Although you present that as you present the as if reasoning as fictionalism, but it seems to me that the as if reasoning is very much how we work with a presupposed basic norm. But actually, Weininger and the fictional basic norm was certainly Kelsen himself saw it as a radical break in his theory. He says somewhere, I now realise that I was mistaken. We shouldn't presuppose the basic norm. We should consider the basic norm as a fiction. And I didn't quite get that sense from your talk of the fictional basic norm as radically different from the presupposed basic norm. And I wonder what you thought about
that. Should I answer now, question by question? Okay. Well, of course, it's the matter of interpretation, especially general theory of norms. It's open texture. So there is this main interpretation which says that Kelsen was mistaken, he discarded basic norm. But then I try to follow other interpretation. For me, radical shift is in understanding of the basic norm in this Hans Weininger framework, which didn't occur earlier. It's different to talk about fiction as hypothesis in neo-Kantian framework, the fact of legal science, or to consider fiction in Weininger's framework, even if it doesn't sound similar. The paths are different. One is neo-Kantian, like Marburg and Baden School, and the other one is the path of fictionalism, which then, from neo-Kantian path, I couldn't reach the conclusion of, I believe it would be different conclusion about fictionalism, even if possible, in neo-Kantian phase. While with Weininger's path, then I apply Weininger's study to his final phase, and I reach a totally different contemporary account on fictionalism. So where I see the difference, it's more in the background. What tools, philosophical tools I can use, treating a starting point fiction as hypothesis or as a fiction.
Thanks, yeah, that's interesting.
Thank you so much. Next, Professor Ian Stewart.
Thank you very much, Jorge. Thank you, Monika, for a very stimulating paper. It has stimulated me in several directions at once. I will try not to ride off in all of them simultaneously. Just a small point, Freie saw himself as a neo-Kantian. He was a Kant expert. But then that doesn't help us at all, as you will know, because neo-Kantianism was a brand name rather than a particular school. There are at least two different schools, and he wasn't part of either of them. Which brings me to the point which Phil talked about. When Kelsen says he's using Weininger, that's at a conference, as you know, Monika, in Salzburg in 1962. It's fascinating to read that. He's not part of a paper. He's the star speaker. He gives a major paper, and then in the course of conversation about something else, he suddenly says, well, by the way, I've come to the conclusion my basic norm is not a hypothesis, as I've always said, but a fiction. And it's a fiction in the sense of being contradictory to reality, and it says contradictory to reality, widersprochen, which is weird, but anyway, it's Weininger's language. Contradicting reality and contradicting itself. And I've tried to pursue what he was at. I think he was lost. He actually didn't know where he was going. And he lent on Weininger in 1962, and then in a paper in Vienna in 1964, although he couldn't get there for illness. And he tried to go on with it, but he never let it go. He's still going with that in the Israel Law Review paper in 1966. Does he follow Weininger? Christophe Bourriot suggests he did not even follow Weininger, because the way that Weininger sees fictions contributing to scientific progress, and the value of fictions in doing that in some way is not contested. The way Weininger saw it was they lead to hypotheses. He didn't spell out how they could lead to hypotheses, and Kelsen doesn't look at it at all. Bourriot suggests that Kelsen doesn't use Weininger because Kelsen doesn't show a way to get from the basic norm as a hypothesis to a hypothesis. Now, the way you go is to look at two fictions. If I've understood them rightly, they are the fictions of is and ought, but there you refer to separation in fact of law and morality. I don't think anybody tries to go for a separation in fact of law and morality. Not Kelsen, nobody. He talks about the logical separation. So there I think your focus is a little bit uncertain. Your second one was separation, you say, of purifying law from its alien elements. I'm sorry, there you are misquoting Kelsen. He talks about purifying science of law from its alien elements. Quite a different thing. So let's leave that. And now, when you come to what Kelsen says about the basic norm is the way lawyers think. Well, sorry, Hans, they don't. He was talking about lawyers thinking in a particular way before he had written about the basic law. Do they think about there being a basic norm somewhere in his sense? I don't think so. What I think one can look at is that lawyers think as if there is a basic norm, as if there is the fiction of something like a hypothesis. And that may be a way to get into the legal mind. So I welcome a longer discussion with you about where you are heading for. I would like to go in the same direction, but perhaps not in the same way.
Thank you for your remarks. I will start with the easiest one, which I can easily agree on. Yes, of course, it's about legal science, not law, purifying law from alien elements. That's a mistake I did in presentation. And of course, it was supposed to be legal science. About the rest, there are many points. I hope I won't forget them. Let's start with fictionalism and whether Kelsen followed Weininger or not. What I do, I'm not trying to reconstruct history. I don't know what was in Kelsen's head. Probably, maybe even if he didn't follow Weininger. I believe it's enough to what he writes. It's compatible enough with Weininger. It uses Weininger vocabulary. And this justifies my examination. What if we interpreted Kelsen's general theory of norms and basic norm as a fiction in Weiningerian terms? And I decided to take such an attempt and see if it restored some coherency, if maybe it would save the basic norm. And I believe that interpreting Kelsen this way does really great favor to general theory of norms, because it explains the place of the basic norm. So I believe my interpretation, if understood not as historical reconstruction, what Kelsen meant, but as some attempt to apply contemporary philosophical tools to Kelsen, which might restore more coherency, which might be compatible with his theory. I believe this is justified, I can do it, and it might well contribute to discussion.
Thank you.
So I know there's one more point about basic norm you mentioned. Oh yes, Neo-Kantians. Yes, of course, Weininger was Neo-Kantian, but it's different to what Kelsen was addressing in his classical phase, where he was inspired by Baden and Marburg school. So I agree with this, Neo-Kantianism is very broad, but very broad thought. So yes, Weininger was also among Neo-Kantians. Also, I saw a paper that he can be accounted as one of logical positivists, or at least he tried to account himself as one of them, but he was rather cursed by logical positivists. So this is not my opinion, this is what I read, who was Weininger. Basically, apparently many labels can be assigned to Weiningers. But yeah, I think what matters here is exactly what Kelsen took from specific author. So we know that Baden and Marburg school influenced his Neo-Kantian phase. And Weininger, maybe Weininger could be compatible with general theory of norms. And finally, basic norm and how lawyers think. I think Kelsen said that. This is the quote from Kelsen, that basic norm illustrates how lawyers think. So we can agree with this or disagree, but I just use what Kelsen said and support this by my thesis. And of course, then I'm very open to discussion if it's fortunate what Kelsen said or not.
Can I come back briefly? Yes, that's what Kelsen said. He says it's in the first edition of Reine Rechtslehre. Now, there is a developing literature, which I think I might join, on how serious Kelsen was with his philosophical references. I think Carsten might like to comment on that one, sir. There's also Pierre Hack, who have suggested that Kelsen was not always sincere with his philosophical references. And Thomas Olechowski's biography, hello Thomas, says that Kelsen in the subtitle is a Rechtswissenschaftler, a legal scientist. Perhaps one could argue he's a legal scientist rather than a legal philosopher. He doesn't actually base himself on any philosopher except Kant. I'll stop there.
Well, yeah, I think it's a very interesting point. So I will thank you for this point, because I believe it's very interesting subject and very broad, whether Kelsen was influenced by Kant or by neo-Kantians, but I tend to agree with you, and also with Carsten Heidemann, so thank you very much.
So I would like to inquire if there are more questions. We still have 10 minutes for discussion on this paper. Gonzalo and Rubin. Gonzalo first.
I have a small question, but I don't know how to formulate it. Last time, in our last session, you talked about the relationship between your thesis of supervenience and this new thesis about fictionalism. You are presented, I mean, in 2 weeks or something like that, you are going to present something about grounding. Could you perhaps tell us more about this thesis, supervenience, grounding, application in Kelsen and fictionalism?
Yes, of course. So there is this question between relations between law and facts, which dominates now legal positivistic debate, which probably should be no problem for Kelsen, because Kelsen declares the separation between is and ought. However, we know that there are also some links, especially in general theory of norms, between law and facts, like the norm is the meaning of the act of will. So here we have relation. And I asked the question, what kind of relation is that? It can be strong relation, because otherwise it would damage separation between is and ought. So I came up into idea that probably this could be supervenience relation between law and fact, because it doesn't impair the Hume guillotine, but it shows how this way from will to norm operates, on which rules. So this is one part of the project, but I also tried to include it in a much larger project. So the main frame, because it all concerns general theory of norms. So in the end, the larger framework is fictionalism and implication of it. And one of the points here is the supervenience as the link between is and ought. And then there is this broader framework, because fictionalism serves understanding, because it's the mode of understanding contrasted with explanation. So also I would like to move there. Did I answer your question?
And you are searching now about grounding with Professor Heidemann.
Yes, that too. So yes, we are researching about grounding, because the basic norm, there is this vocabulary which suggests that there might be grounding involved in case of basic norm, if we look to general theory of norms, for example. But so far, our conclusion is that either grounding concept would have to be modified, or basic norm concept would have to be modified in order to apply one to another. So it's not that obvious that we have grounding here in case of the basic norm, but it's still under development. So maybe we'll find a way how to make the basic norm and grounding fully compatible. But of course, there are some overlaps. It's not that it doesn't fit at all. There are some points where grounding works well with basic norm.
Thank you. Rubin, please.
Hi, hello. In fact, I don't have a question about it because I don't know nothing about fictionalism, and I don't know about Hans Wengler. I don't know if the pronunciation is correct. I just read about, and what I know is that Hans Wengler was not a philosopher of science. He was a philosopher of art, and he's not talking about epistemological. In fact, he's a talk about beauty and ugly and something like that. And so if this is true, it would be a huge change for Kelsen from a new Kantian vision or a scientific vision or even a logic positivism vision to an art vision. So if it's correct that Hans Wengler was a philosopher of art, should I say that pure theory of law, it's a theory of art of law, and it's not what law is, but law is in a context of beauty and ugly or something like that. I'm sorry about this. It's just what I'm thinking about. Thank you.
Did I understand you correctly? You mean that Weininger is philosopher of art? Well, I don't know him from this angle. I know his book, The Fictions as If, and some commentaries on this book, also contemporary commentaries from scholars who are dealing with fictions in science. So if that's the case, then probably you have very interesting field to research, but I would have to get to know Weininger's thought on this matter to have opinion about that.
Yeah, because in the philosophy faculty, we studied Wengler. It's not deeply studied, but it's not in the philosophy of science, but in the philosophy of art chair. Or I asked you about this, and I have this question about Kelsen, if he's changed so deeply from a scientific view of law to an art view of law. Just this. Thank you.
That's definitely an interesting idea.
Is there any other question in the last 5 minutes of the talk? I have a quick one, but I would like to give other people the opportunity. Well, it's not a quick one, so that's just why I'm not talking. Yeah.
Jorge, just very briefly, because I'm conscious of the time, I have to thank all, particularly Monika Zalewska, because it's her second time with us, a pleasure. And I have to say, what a pleasure to be here with this exchange. Amazing, amazing. Ian, Rubin, Monika, it's amazing. I'm still thinking, I think we have room for 2 or 3 PhDs right now with all these questions. So thank you very much. Just a brief comment, but I wanted to acknowledge because this exchange was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jorge, for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure and always honor to be here in the framework of Juris North.
No, I just want to second Jorge's. Jorge is seconding Jorge, but I want to second. I think this was the point of this conference, And I have seen wonderful discussions these days, and this is one example of all of them. So as a convener, these are the things we were expecting for when we organized. So I want to thank you all for doing a Saturday morning for me. So and taking time. Thank you to everybody. So yeah. So I think yeah. Sorry.
Just I wanted to thank you.
So I think there are more questions. So my question is actually about the nature of reality, but this is not a fair question to ask in the sense, what is reality for fictionalism? And it seems to be like three-dimensional reality, but this is a larger point, and I don't think we have time for that larger point. And what would be the difference between this reality of fictionalism and constructing realities for analytical jurisprudence, analytical philosophers who wants to explain things in new realities and not saying this is but okay, it's out there. So yeah, we have 2 minutes.
So answering you, this is a very good question, of course. Fictionalism tries not to commit in any definition of reality. It rather avoids the problem of reality, but just by indicating that this is a fiction and we should act as if this is some sort of response to nominalism, which is different from realism. And also, this ontological fictionalism originated as a response that even if nominalism said that the abstract concept don't take place, fictionalism said actually we shouldn't discard them because they are fictions. So and that's why I think it makes it easier with the question of reality, because here we don't need to define reality, we just need to define that this is a fiction. And if we identify even more fictions than in reality, then that's fine. But of course, then there is this trap that we might start to fictions everywhere. So to some extent, might be a good idea to define this reality. So I believe, yes, this is a very good question.
No, thank you, but I am more puzzled now. I am puzzled about the idea of, because fiction seems to be some as opposed to reality, but and it could go either way. It could go both ways. Now everything is part of reality. So, for instance, I don't know, money could be a fiction because it's not three-dimensional in one sense, and it's not the paper money, or it's not the value of the money. So my interpretation could be like many things could be part of reality and not fictions. So we could go like we can multiply fictions or we can multiply realities if we don't have a clear standard on either way.
I think then you would commit to some sort of strong realism. I'm not that big expert on realism and nominalism, but realists tend to say that reality is a very extended concept, while nominalists just take a small part of it as something which belongs to reality. And fictionalism is somewhere in between. But of course, then, as a nominalist, you could have something to tell about fictions, and also a realist might have something to tell about fictions. That's my intuition here, because I think now we are very deeply in philosophical account, which is extremely interesting discussion, but probably very broad one.
No, so thank you, and this is a fair point, because I'm asking you the question: what is the nature of reality? And I don't think that's fair and something to be discussed in 2 minutes.
Yes, I think it's impossible.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your kind answer. Gonzalo wants to say something, but I think we're over time. So I think we and I want to keep enough time for the presentations, because we have two additional presentations, and it's going to be the last paper seminars. As you are familiar at this moment, in these paper seminars, there are two papers that are closely related, and they're presented together, and then we have some time for discussions. So the two papers are going to have between 25-30 minutes for presentation, and then we have around 25-30 minutes for discussion of both papers together. We chose this strategy because many of these papers come together and they have relationships, and there are interesting opportunities for engagement and for discussion. So our first paper presenter, sorry, and please join me in thanking again Monika for a wonderful presentation. It has been an exchange, and it has been a wonderful experience, and all participants for their contributions.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Yeah. So. And now we move to the papers. The first of the two presenters is Dr. Rubin Assis de Silveira from the Law School of University of Sao Paulo, and he will be talking about Kelsen's on Kant's pure and practical reason contradiction. So, Rubin, please.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you for this Congress. Let's see. First of all, I just say that this my work is still in progress. It's a work in progress, and just to say to forgive me any error or grammar or even my poor skill of pronunciation mistakes. So I prepare. I prepare some slides to share this. I'm sharing the slides with you. It's okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just read my draft paper and explain my slides. It's just 3 quotes of Kelsen, Theory of Law, Generative Law State, and What is Justice. And after that, I have some schemes to explain my position. So the title is this: Kelsen on Kant's pure and practical reason contradiction. And a very short abstract, I say the present paper sustain the inconsistency of Kelsen's thesis on Kant. It understands that his hypothesis of contradiction between pure and practical reason, as well as the idea of is and out confusion, is not sustainable considering Kant's works and contemporary literature on the author. The introduction, I say, in the legal academy, the reference to Kelsen's papers and books spread at the same level of the complexification of a juridical political system and the necessity of deals with several problems foreseen by the author during the development of his fundamental concepts. Theories like absolute separation of law and moral, law and state monism, national international law monism, and causation imputation logic are current in the nowadays debate. Further, in the recent years, in the recent years, his doctrine has promoted high-level studies on the problem of state arbitrariness. So the motivation for this ascent is his non-cognitivist meta-ethic philosophy. With this, the author denies the Kantian practical reason, promotes absolute distinction between moral and law, and paves the way to the discussion about authorities' discretionary decision-making. Thus not submitted to any meta-juridical justification. In this sense, his focus contradiction modern Kantianists and contemporary moral cognitivists like Rawls, Habermas, Jorge, etc. Considering the importance of Kelsen legal philosophy, especially regarding the judicial decision-making problem, The present work aims to clarify his main concept and deals with some controversies about his interpretation of Kant. This distinction appears because there are significant antagonisms in his reading of Kant's moral philosophy. Thus, the paper intends to analyze and interpret Kelsen's main concept considering Kant's practical theory. First, I present Kelsen's skeptical ideas on practical theory, particularly his conception of pure and practical reason. And the second part introduces Kant's practical philosophy. Therefore, I divide the paper into two comparative chapters. And the first chapters introduce the two crucial points to Kelsen pure theory, the absolute separation between is and out, and analyzes how Kelsen comprehends Kant in a broad sense and how his conception go close and far from Kant's concept of science, states, and moral. In the second chapter, I tracks Kant's practical philosophy, and I intend to demonstrate that Kelsen made significant mistakes and represented an unacceptable interpretation of Kant's practical theory. I sustain his accusation against Kant do not have any plausibility if you take Kant's work serious. In this sense, I defend the plausibility of the hypothesis of contradiction between the critique of pure reason and the critique of practical reason argued by Kelsen. Considering Kant's critiques, we cannot find in the critique of practical reason the claim of confusion between is and out sustained by Kelsen, just because out in a practical sense is entirely a priori. Hence, theoretical proposition which include experience and aesthetics remain synthetic a priori and completely separate from the pure practical philosophy, which, on the other hand, remains entirely pure. Finally, the present paper achieved his final goal. It has demonstrated that Kelsen's thesis against Kant is wrong. So in the first paragraph, in the first chapter, it's about Kelsen, Kant according to Kelsen. And the majority of legal specialists describe Kelsen's legal philosophy as a neo-Kantian. And according to the author, and this is my first quote in the Pure Theory of Law, insofar as only the presupposition of the basic norm makes it possible to interpret the subjective meaning of the Constitution creating act and of the act established according to the Constitution as their objective meaning, that is, as objectively valid legal norm, the basic norm as represented by the science of law may be characterized as the transcendental logical condition of his interpretation, if it is permissible to use by analogy a concept of Kant's epistemology. Kant asked, how is it possible to interpret without a metaphysical hypothesis the facts perceived by our senses in the law of nature formulated by natural science? The epistemological answer of the pure theory of law is, by presupposition, the basic norm that one ought to behave as the Constitution prescribes, that is, one ought to behave in accordance with the subjective meaning of the Constitution creating act of will, according to the prescriptions of the authority creating the Constitution. End of the quote. And furthermore, his neo-Kantianism supposedly originate from Marburg and Baden School, based on Hermann Cohen, Wildeben, Simmels, so on theories. This reference indicates that Kelsen applies only a part of Kant philosophy as the pure theory of law, theoretical scientific basis. In short, as part of his philosophical groundwork, He cuts off all Kantian metaphysics considered by him contradictory in a rupture against the first critique. And this is my second quote. And the generator of law state, in fact, appends it to the second edition to Theory of Law. And Kelsen says, the last of the types we have here developed, which is contrast to the metaphysical, has been described as critical dualism. Evidently, there's the feature of Kant's philosophy of critical idealism. Yet it will be immediately observed that Kant's philosophical system differs somewhat from our ideal pictures. This is already the case in his natural philosophy. The struggle with his philosophical genius supported by science waged against metaphysics, which earned him to the ultimate conclusion, In character, he was probably no real fighter, but rather disposed to compromise conflicts. The role which the thing in itself plays in his system reveals a good deal of metaphysical transcendence. For this reason, we do not find in his a frank and uncompromising confession of relativism, which is the inescapable consequence of any real elimination of metaphysics. A complete emancipation from metaphysics was probably impossible for a personality still as deeply rooted in Christianity as Kant. This is most evident in his practical philosophy. Just here, where the emphasis of the Christian doctrine rests, his metaphysical dualism has completely invaded his system, the same dualism which Kant fought so persistent in his theoretical philosophy. End of the quote. And Kelsen aims with these methods to found his juridical theory on the Kant's critique of pure reason without recognizing the critique of practical reason, critique of power of judgment, groundwork of metaphysical of moral, and metaphysical of moral, even against Kant's own words. However, according to the best interpretation, Kant states his practical philosophy into the first critique, pure reason, with which authorizes its existence to an exclusive a priori method. Hence, there's an intrinsic link between pure reason, practical reason, moral rules, and law. According to Kelsen, it is impossible to build or recognize objective, rational, or categorical moral system. Moral norms says that all efforts to justify the categorical imperatives resulted in empty, in no sense rules, often used to support contradicted values. Therefore, the category imperative cannot reach its final goal of creating objective moral rules. Consequently, Kant's morality would support authoritarian, conservative, and moralist views. Through this method, Kelsen uses the critique of pure reason as the core of pure theory of law. However, in the practical and moral sphere, he agrees with any other skeptical mainstream theories from his time, such as Vienna Circle Neo-Positivism, Vienna Law School, Moore, and Emotivism Metaethics, and Sigmund Freud Psychoanalysis. Since then, he refused and denies Kantian moral and practical philosophy. Consequently, he rejects Kant law and use naturalism theory. Maintaining this aspect, the pure theory of law follow the idea of a rupture inside theoretical and practical philosophy. And one of Kelsen's most critical arguments concerns the Kantian separation between is and out. It is under this separation that Kelsen accused Kant of contradiction. It's the second part of the same chapter, the is and out problem. Kelsen say that according to Kelsen, Kant only deals with the causation problem in his first critique, refuting classical metaphysics and empiricism, especially from Christian Wolff and David Hume. In this sense, the transcendental theory provides synthetic a priori concepts which allow appending a predicate or a quality to a subject, avoid at the same time the causation problem, and passing far from the metaphysical and dialectic questions. In this sense, Kant proposes a synthetic a priori theory defend that all knowledge rises from experience, but does not restrict itself to the same experience. The fact of reason can process factual information and builds concepts that organize and creates meanings for these empirical facts. This faculty of reason is active, thus the reason creates a priori ideas through the mind and not from the object or experience. Consequently, you can understand that knowledge to Kant begins from experience, but this experience does not limit it. Besides, after passing through the faculty of reason, you comprehend that this experience does not represent objects in itself. Hence, the faculty of reason acts by changing impression and systematization sensibly work into methodological science. In other words, all knowledgeable comes from experience. However, this experience transmutes itself through an active reason that processes these facts and create concepts that allow us to organize our experience in a coherent system. Kelsen aims to achieve the same level as Kant's Transcendental Philosophy, considering the basic norm, the ground norm, as a synthetic a priori concept. In this case, the jurist vindicates his ground norm as well as Kant's pure reason theory as a synthetic a priori proposition. It means that act of will is not only apprehended passively from experience, but you can interpret it as ought, solid. In a room, for example, some people raise their hands while another speaks on a pulpit. We can describe these acts as an act of will, but you can interpret that act as an election where is voting some rules representing the meaning of this act of will. Therefore, the juridical norms are this meaning of act of will, transcendently grounded. Okay, this is an out in Kelsen and Kant, and now the last part of the first chapter is an out in this contradiction that Kelsen accused Kant. So I'm saying Kant's theoretical philosophy, defend Kelsen, has a clear distinction between is and out. Nevertheless, in his practical philosophy, the author seeks to reconnect those categories. Consequently, it turns the practical proposition into a natural fallacy. In this sense, Kelsen sustains that Kant not confunded is and out in his pure reason, except only in his practical reason. It means that Kelsen appoints an internal contradiction. In this aspect, David Hume, as says Kelsen, was wiser than Kant was. According to Kelsen in generative law, even considering the unductal separation between an act of will and the meaning of this act, Kant contradicts the pure reason and supports a religion and mystical, moral, and legal philosophy. Kant's deeply Christian roots were responsible for maintaining the outer bound in the metaphysical Juris naturalism, which holds the necessity of connection between is and out under a fundamentalist view of nature and society. In short, to Kelsen, Kant's practical philosophy was not more than Christian proselytism, constituted by conservative value and pseudo-natural rules. Specifically, concerning the categorical imperative problem, Kelsen defends the formula as a nonsense. empty of meaning and inefficient to fix any moral norms as true or false, valid or invalid. The categorical imperative would be the definitive answer to the question what to do or what is justice. Instead, it's only support arbitrary norms, conservative politics, and democratic governance. And now I have my last quote. So in the what is justice, Kelsen says, the concrete examples by which Kant tries to illustrate the application of his categorical imperatives are precepts of the traditional moral and the positive law of his time. They are not, as the doctrine of the categorical imperative pretends, deduced from his principle, for nothing can be deduced from this empty formula. They prove only to be compatible with it, and any present of any established social order is compatible with the principle that says nothing else but that the individual shall act in conformity with general norms. Thus, the categorical imperative, just as the golden rule, can serve as a justification of any social order. This possibility explains why this formula, in spite of, or rather because of, their emptiness, are still and probably always will be accepted as satisfactory answer to the question of justice. To the question of what is justice. So, in this sense, Kelsen argues against the categorical imperative using the casuistic problem brought up for Kant in his critique of practical reason, groundwork of metaphysical of moral, and metaphysical of moral. There are four generic Kant duties contested by Kelsen: perfect duties to ourselves, perfect duties to our others, imperfect duties to our others, and perfect duties to our others. The first one represents predetermined obligations by practical reason to our action, such as a non-suicide. The second one is the duty predetermined by in face to other, for example, pay the debts. The third one is the kind of responsibilities that rules in generic way on how the individual must direct their lives, for example, providing self-development. And the last one, the imperfect duties to our other, is generic also, and represented the commandment to respect others no matter the situation. So, according to Kelsen, all these duties do not originate from the categorical imperative. Instead, this arises from Christian values, which are not universal, but only obligatory if someone accepts them. Thus, Kant's practical philosophy is not more than religion proselytism and serve at last to provide and justify conservatives and reactionary rules. The second chapter I'll start with the Kant position, and now I just put 2 slides to explain my position. So this is Kant according to Kelsen. Kelsen says that the pure reason is in the top of the system, and after that, the transcendental logic, science, is, and at the end, theory of law, the purity of law. And different from this theoretical or the science for Kant is the practical reason. And Kelsen says that practical reason starts with Christian proselytism, after a practical reason, moralism, or in philosophy of law, no, not theory of law. So I would say that let me show the Kantian scheme. I would say so. In Brazil, we have a long tradition of the Kantians. We have several professors and specialists in Kant, and all my my supervisors in the philosophy academy. All day was a specialist in Kant. My first one was Professor Joãozinho de Camp, and the second was Professor Dalamar Dutra. And also another professor in the United States that I made a part of my PhD, Professor Frederick Hauscher. They are unanimous to say that this idea of Kelsen, of rupture between practical and pure reason, has no logic and no text correspondence. And also I use it in my tests, some others specialists in Kant, like Paul Aguiar, Sinwing, Karsten, I would say that majority of this specialists in Kant says that the position of Kelsen is not correct, and the correct reading of Kant is that. So in the first one, we have not the critical pure reason. The first is the transcendental philosophy. The transcendental philosophy justify or the system of the Kant theory of knowledge and moral. After that, you have the critique of pure reason. And after critique of pure reason, as an authorization of the critique of pure reason, you have a critique of practical reason. In a sense, it's just a priori, not synthetic a priori, just a priori. And for this is a possible critique of practical reason, avoiding dialects or something like that, ontologies of reason. And after that, categorical imperative doctrine, doctrine of duties, and law. So we'll have not this division and contradiction between Kelsen and Kant. So I will conclude my presentation of some final considerations. So Kant's morality denies all experiences and its philosophical basis. On the same level, the law, through a methodological and systematic interpretation, must be seen as part of practical reason, since the authorization of its existence follows a sequence from pure reason to the doctrine of right. In the same way, as the law is a moral authorization and the morality a consequence of the a priori method, we conclude that law is a part of the categorical imperative doctrine. In these terms, law is not the obedience to heterogeneous wishes, neither formulated by external legislation, and does not have any subjection to the hypothetical imperatives. Since these premises, we present the present paper results in the following conclusions. First, the exteriority of the law does not admit the interpretation that positive norm as hypothetical imperatives. Its exterior is only a distinction of moral doctrine of duties and law, and not a separation between law and moral. Second, state coercion in this sequence is not an arbitrary punishment, just because coercion has the same universal end of preserving maximum freedom and allowed by practical reason and pure reason. In this sense, moral law, through categorical imperative, legitimates state's constitution to exercise social coercion and promote max freedom in a priori sense. Hence, even the state and positive law have their origin in pure practical reason and, at first, in the pure reason. As the state formation occurs through the practical reason authorization, this same state has no empirical elements. That is, Kant's example and the groundwork of metaphysical moral are only demonstrative. They are only models of a recognized moral that still keeps a non-philosophical foundation. In this sense, Kelsen's exemplification to prove Kant's contradiction seems irrelevant to comprehend the critique of practical reason and the formation of the state and law. as consequently, pure theory is not categorical error in his consequently pure, there's no categorical error in its practical reason and its doctrine rise, since both are a priori. He said, it asked, Kelsen's charge of contradiction between pure and practical reason is wrong. The practical reason is a kind of different use of reason, which separates itself from the pure reason in terms of synthetic element in its logic, but not contradict the same reason. And the last conclusion, consequently, Kant's critical project partly raised his concern with the moral law necessity university, or the a priori nature. Therefore, the analysis of his whole works show us to conclude that the critique of pure reason as an outcome not only of theoretical but also practical consideration. Mainly, it shows the close link between practical and theoretical philosophy in Kant for the practical problem of finding a ground for a priori valid norm law was partly responsible for leading Kant to work out the theoretical issues of the status of the faculty of reason and understanding, which supply a priori principle. In this sense, Kant morality disproved all experience in his philosophical groundwork, as well as the pure reason avoids a posteriori judgment. Therefore, it does not exist in the practical reason in the doctrine of right any categorical error, since both are completely a priori. It asks, Kelsen's accusation against Kant, Kelsen's accusation against the supposed Kant contradiction between pure and practical reason in terms of is and out separation is a misinterpretation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rubin, for an excellent presentation, and that gives an interesting insight about the connections between between Kelsen, which is often discussed as a Kantian, and his own views on Kant. So now we will move to the second paper, which is by Cristiano, Portela, Moita from the University of Berlin, and he will talk about Wittgenstein's rules following paradox in Kelsen's account of legal interpretation. So, Cristiano?
Okay, just a sec. Let me share my screen. Just a moment. Well, can you hear me? Suddenly.
Yes.
Okay. I just want to ask if you can see the slides passing. Can you see it? Or are the slides paralyzed?
We can see them.
Okay, so let me start. Just a moment. So in first place, hi everyone. I'd like also to accompany the companies, both Jorge and Gonzalo, by saying that these 2 days have been mind-blowing, and that's why I'd like to say thank you to the companies and the colleagues for this amazing event. And secondly, since the last presentation to this one, some of the ideas have been settled, and the presentation was slightly changed. As the core of my insights is linguistic, I've had the opportunity to present the same ideas in the Congress of the International Language Law Association, so I could solve some problems of clarity in the line of argumentation. So the title of my presentation is Wittgenstein's Rule Following Paradox in Kelsen's account of legal interpretation. The paper presents a very modest linguistic conceptual argument. It precisely addresses the chapter Kelsen handles with language, which is the last chapter, the chapter 8 of his analysis later. And I try to show that part of Kelsen's arguments relies on a linguistic flaw, And this is the reason I resort to Wittgenstein's considerations about language. But I don't want to criticize Kelsen only for the sake of criticism. Since we are paying a tribute to the anniversary of the book, I want to fortify some of his theoretical devices as well, such as the idea of a cognitive interpretation. If we could even assume it as a fiction, if I may use the presentation of Zalewska, connected, of course, with the scientific point of view, as well as the idea that efficacy is a condition of validity of norms and of legal orders. So in doing that, I think that we could shed light in some important aspects of legal theory in general. I could even sum up my presentation as follows: adjusting a specific flaw in Kelsen's account of interpretation, we might fortify other aspects of the theory presented in this book, to which we are paying a homage. So this time I'm going to be brief in presenting Wittgenstein's paradox so that I could spend more time exploring Kelsen's account. So what is Wittgenstein's paradox of following a rule? Here, the remark 198 from Philosophical Investigations is a brief dialogue between Wittgenstein and his imagined interlocutor. So says interlocutor, but how can a rule teach me what I have to do at this point? After all, whatever I do can, on some interpretation, be made compatible with the rule. So Wittgenstein's answers: no, that's not what one should say. Rather this: every interpretation hangs in the air together with what interprets and cannot give it any support. Interpretations by themselves do not determine meaning. So is whatever I do compatible with the rule? And that is the manifestation of the paradox. Remark 201 from Philosophical Investigations. This was our paradox. No course of action could be determined by a rule, because every course of action can be brought into accord with the rule. If every course of action can be brought into accord with the rule, then it can also be brought into conflict with it. And so there will be neither accord nor conflict here. So imagine the case of two persons following a rule or applying a rule, but each one interprets the rule differently, so that what they follow or apply is not the rule, but their interpretation of the rule. The paradox is the impossibility of following a rule. If we follow a rule, if following a rule is always subjected to a personal subjective interpretation. So if I follow an interpretation of the rule, and if there might be different interpretations and alternatives, then we don't follow a rule at all. Therefore, in trying to act according to a rule that should bind us, the rule at the end of the day would not bind us at all. So as to the solution of the paradox, I remember bringing it. This is the signpost case, which is brought by Wittgenstein himself. So the solution to the paradox goes like this. Please look at the signpost. Intuitively, we interpret the rule as we should follow the street, especially because the arrowhead points at this direction. This is how we interpret this, the very basic rule of following the signpost. But if following a rule is to follow an interpretation of the rule, why don't we follow the other arrowheads? These interpretations are, of course, absurd, but they are also possible interpretations. Why don't we interpret the arrow as going the direction indicated by the base of the arrow, for instance? So comes the solution of the paradox. Let me ask this. What has the expression of a rule? Just a second. What has the expression of a rule, say a signpost, got to do with my actions? What sort of connection obtains here? Well, this one, for example, I've been trained in a particular way to the sign, to react in a particular way to the sign. And now I do so, react to it. A person goes by a signpost only so far as there is an established usage, a custom. What we thereby show is that there is a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation, but which, from case to case of application, is exhibited in what we call following the rule and going against it. So I should stress this point, especially because I mentioned Andre Marmor at this moment. So there is a way of grasping in a rule, which is not an interpretation, but which from case to case of application is exhibited in what we call following the rule and going against it. That's why there is an inclination to say every action according to a rule is an interpretation. But one should speak of interpretation only when one expression of a rule is substituted for another. That's why following a rule is a practice. And here, I reject Kripke's view on what is a praxis presented on the remark 202, and agree with Haker and Baker's, according to which the remark that following a rule is a practice has nothing directly to do with social practices, as Kripke once famously argued. Its exclusive concern is with the fact that rule following is an activity, a normative regularity of conduct which exhibits one's Auffassung or grasping of a rule, manifests how one understands a rule. So why I1? Well, going through the street would be a correct interpretation. Because only I1 is an established usage, custom, a practice attached to the signpost. Any of the other alternatives would be deemed as absurd interpretations. The other I's are interpretations stricto sensu. It attempts to substitute the rule towards the signpost. Well, now let's jump to Kelsen's account, which is not a theory nor a doctrine. Here I follow Paulson's paper about Kelsen's interpretation. Kelsen's account of legal interpretation. So I've collected here some tenets presented in the chapters that I assume all of you are very acquainted with. So the necessity of interpretation for observing or applying a norm. If law is to be applied by a legal organ, he must determine the meaning of the norms to be applied. He must interpret these norms. In short, there is an interpretation of all legal norms insofar they must be applied. Application is never completely determined by a superior norm, a second tenet. This determination can never be complete. The higher norm cannot bind in every direction the act by which it is applied. There must always be more or less room for discretion. Even the most detailed command must leave to the individual executing the command some discretion. The law to be applied is a frame within which there are multiple possibilities of application. This is the title of one of the topics of the chapter, which was translated by Max Knight simply as the law to be applied is a frame. A norm may be created which lies entirely outside the frame, represented by the norm to be applied, a very polemic excerpt from this chapter. So now, contrasting both accounts, the Wittgenstein's paradox and Kelsen's account. If our norm is always subjected to interpretation, and if there is always room for discretion, and if the result of this interpretation might lead to different possibilities, then how the interpreter could be guided by a norm after all? That seems to amount to the paradox. I mean, of course, there are subtleties here. I'm just stretching the paradox. We might discuss it later. So if the interpreter indeed always determines the meaning and creates a norm, as Kelsen pointed out, but never follows or applies an existing one, what he's doing is providing interpretations in Wittgenstein's terms, and that seems to confirm the paradox. So the legal organ as an interpreter would never be in position to apply an existing norm. The individuals would never be in position to act according to a norm, and the scientists would never be in position to describe existing norms, for in every circumstance the norm would be subjected to interpretation, and then there would not be a norm to be followed. And here I come to the final part of the presentation, where I assess Kelsen's account. On the one hand, indicating the flaw I've promised at the beginning of the presentation. So on the one hand, Kelsen's account falls short in explaining the case of stabilized meanings, or how legal theorists tend to call the case of easy cases. So at a linguistic level, we have the stabilized meanings, or cognitive interpretation might amount to one meaning. Cognitive interpretation is only possible if the interpreter follows some rules as established practices concerning the meaning of the words and do not interpret them. So communication is only possible if we agree with a lot of basic rules basic rules referring to words. to what words mean. So otherwise, legal interpretation would amount to an endless activity of finding possible, legitimate meanings within the frame, and that would amount to the paradox again. After all, basic communication presupposes established practices attached to words, as Bix recognizes, though he criticizes that the relevance of this very basic consensus to legal interpretation. So connected with the idea of stabilizing meanings are the idea of easy cases. And here I stress the importance of easy cases. There are some legal theories who are dedicated to addressing easy cases in legal theory, because to some extent it was neglected, especially because of the attention paid to the so-called hard cases. So I bring here also the idea that easy cases are important as well. A norm I have a stabilized, correct meaning in this specific day-to-day situation or easy cases, which is the one that corresponds to an existing practice when it is possible to identify a practice, say the signpost case, or say a stabilized understanding by a court towards a specific topic. In a specific sense, determination might be complete. The interpreter might not have room for discretion. Accordingly, a frame might not even exist. This is precisely what Andre Marmor called understanding a rule, grasping the meaning based on Wittgenstein's considerations, instead of interpreting it. One has a complete grasp of a rule if under normal circumstances, one is able to specify which acts are in accord with the rule and hence which would go against it. So this looking at texts and attached established practices referring to words carried out by the legal scientists might be seen as an epistemic constraint, and the cognitive interpretation would reduce the role played by the volitive interpretation in determining the frame, hence constraining the discretion of the interpreter. Though very likely Kelsen will reveal this constraint as pure political, not scientific. So stabilized meanings. So Kelsen's account falls short in explaining stabilized meanings and easy cases. On the other hand, if we adjust this little flaw as I argued, we might even fortify another theoretical device of Kelsen's line of text later. So on the other hand, considering easy cases is taken seriously the theoretical key, efficacy as a condition of validity. So Kelsen's account of legal interpretation is incompatible with his account of efficacy as a condition of validity, so I contend, if it does not consider easy cases. For a norm has efficacy only so far as observed and applied, but observance and application must be practices performed by people, must be an established practice. What has efficacy is the behavior stipulated by a stabilized meaning, or the practice attached to the normative text in Wittgenstein's terms. A norm subjected to a modificative interpretation allowed by the frame is not efficacious anymore because the practice attached to it was changed. In this case, what might have efficacy is the new created norm, precisely the new practice attached to the normative text. Therefore, efficacy presupposes stabilized meanings. The idea of efficacy must go hand in hand with the idea of easy cases of stabilized meanings. In highlighting the easy cases, Kelsen's theoretical key efficacy as a condition of validity is taken more seriously, despite Kelsen's loose account of discretion in legal interpretation. It sheds light on one of the most important and difficult relations of the positivist legal theory, which is the relation between validity and efficacy, according to Kelsen, and it is likewise to take seriously another theoretical device, but deepening it. The principle of legitimacy is limited by the principle of effectiveness. So we could shed light on these theoretical devices presented in the pure theory of law. Plus, assuming that the legal science must presuppose the Grundnorm, pointing at an efficacious legal order, then legal interpretation is not just a matter of understanding text, but embedded with it, a matter of being consistent with established practices connected with texts, or I must put these terms, a matter of being consistent with stabilized meaning. So legal interpretation must handle the idea that there are stabilized meanings. This conceptual insight might even be relevant for the legal sociologist. Understanding the uses and the abuses of the normative texts might contribute to identifying and criticizing practices of symbolic constitutionalism, disguised as concretized constitutional norms, which are pervasive in the peripheral modernity. So a very well-known practice of symbolic attitude by the interpreter is to say that a specific norm has efficacy, a specific constitutional norm has efficacy, but this efficacy is not connected with a sense which would be allegedly more democratic or more compatible with, let me use this term, the spirit of the Constitution. So these are the bibliography mentioned in the presentation, and here I'm finished with it. So thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Cristiano, for a clear and to the point presentation. And actually, we have 30 minutes for discussion and maybe a bit more. So I would like to invite all the questions we have in these two excellent presentations, the one by Rubin on Kelsen on Kant's pure and practical reason contradiction, and Wittgenstein, and the one by Cristiano on Wittgenstein and rule following. And thank you, Edith, for your kind words. We really appreciate them.
Well, curiously, I have a question for Rubin. I don't know if there's something in the queue. There's someone in the queue, right?
There is no. There is Gonzalo, but yeah, let's begin with Cristiano, then Gonzalo.
No, please, Gonzalo. I just didn't see any questions here.
Gonzalo is waving the right, so please, Cristiano.
Okay, so I'd like to ask Rubin, because a presentation before we're discussing about I don't know who said that, but there is a well-known discussion about the improprieties that Kelsen committed in quoting other philosophers, right? And one of them is Kant. So I'd like that, if possible, Rubin could comment on this bad importation or could comment on this misquotation by Kelsen's on Kant's. However, stressing the idea that Kelsen was a new Kantian and he had some criticisms towards Kant himself. So I think that would be my question.
Should I answer now? I'm waiting for.
So yes, please. You can answer now. Yeah.
Okay. So as you know, Kelsen is not a very welcome author in the philosophy faculties, especially, I don't know in other parts, but in Brazil is not welcome. Exactly this misquotation and errors that the Kelsen commit against other authors. I wrote a paper 4 years ago about Kelsen and Hobbes, and it's a lot of problems in Kelsen and Hobbes, and also it's a lot of problems with Kelsen and other authors. And I think that in fact Kelsen was not a philosopher, and he hadn't a philosophical training and how to work with the philosophical concepts and something like that. I'm not saying that the theory of Kelsen is we should trash the theory of Kelsen, because this some people would say that is better do not know philosophy to understand the law. It's better to do this, but in fact there's a lot of errors in Kelsen and other quotation. In terms of neo-Kantian philosophy, I would say that even in neo-Kantianism, we not have this kind of separation or accusation of contradiction between pure and practical reasoning in Kant. We have another discussion like the a priori groundwork in Hermann Cohen, for example, and you had we have the other discussion like in Portuguese a coisa em si. I don't remember how to say.
The thing in itself, it was in your place.
The thing in itself, it's another kind of this discussion in neo-Kantianism, and I think that this contradiction between pure and practical reason is not the main discussion between them. And I'm not sure about this, but I think just Kelsen asked for this contradiction between pure and practical reason. I don't know if you understand my. I can try respond Portuguese after that.
No, I understand it quite clearly.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rubin. So first Gonzalo and then Jorge, who asked a question in the chat.
I would like to jump in the same point. Do you think that is the first question for Rubin? Do you think that there is a direct influence of Kant in Kelsen, or this influence passed through the neo-Kantianism, and which authors do you think that played the main role? And the question for, I have a lot of questions, a bunch of questions for Cristiano, but I just want to point out two. The first one is that you quote a very famous paper of Professor Paulson from 1990. And in this paper, he argues saying that there is no theory of interpretation in Kelsen. But the title of your presentation and your paper suppose that there is a theory of interpretation in Kelsen. So I don't know what do you understand under this name, theory of interpretation in Kelsenian words. And the second question is about the term efficacy. You said that the stability in meaning is needed for efficacy. But I think that for many reasons, you cannot understand validity in terms of membership, for example, without this stability meaning. Or do you think that in Kelsen there is other possibilities? That is the question.
So let's go in order. I think Rubin first.
I don't know. I don't remember very well. The question is about the difference between Kant and neo-Kantians.
No, if you think that there is a direct influence from Kant in Kelsen, or the influence come from neo-Kantians, because it's a big discussion, and I don't know if I get your point very well in your presentation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, I think Kelsen do not refers to neo-Kantian frequently, and my last presentation here, Professor Paulson talked about the Kelsen has the only one text about the neo-Kantian, but was not so clear about that. So Kelsen did not talk about neo-Kantians and did not say this word neo-Kantians in purity of law, general of law, general of norms. When he talk about this problem, he's always talk about Kant and the transcendental logic and the basic norm grounded a priori or synthetic a priori, something like that, and then he not talk directly about the neo-Kantians. I think that it's most specialist discussion. So the commentators always says that Kelsen was a neo-Kantian, like Bobbio, for example, Norbert Bobbio, and this is spread this idea that Kelsen is a neo-Kantian in this sense, but I'm not sure about that. And even the neo-Kantians, I'm not sure if the neo-Kantians says that the same or made the same interpretation of the contradiction between pure and practical reason. I know very well that the Kantian specialists specialists in Kant do not do this kind of contradiction, and they refuse, in fact, very strongly this idea. But I'm not sure if there is a specific author in the neo-Kantian tradition that support this idea of. I know that Hermann Cohen do not do this, and so this is the answer.
So please, Cristiano.
Okay, thank you. So, as to the question, if I say that Kelsen has a theory of interpretation, it's presented in the slides. It's on the topic of the slides. Kelsen's account, parenthesis, not a theory, nor a doctrine. See Paulson, 1990's paper of legal interpretation. So I strategically use Kelsen's account of legal interpretation and explicitly say that we shouldn't use the expression theory of interpretation nor doctrine of interpretation. It is presented in the slides, but I'm going to read a part of the introduction of my paper, which might shed light on this topic as well. So notorious is the inclusion of a chapter on interpretation and history theory of law, as are the critiques it received, ranging from those who dismiss Kelsen's account as a theory of interpretation or deem it as a sheer wrong account, to those who contend his last chapter is the culmination of a constant target of Kelsen's attacks, namely the dogmatic tradition used to defend the possibility of a one right answer contained in a legal text. This is presented in Paulson's famous paper. And I think that he is, to some extent, he agrees with the idea that the whole point of the chapter 8 was another attack to those who think that there is a possible one right answer interpretation. But I say that as a matter of fact. However, there is some consensus that Kelsen does not elaborate a theory of how the juries should interpret the text. It is not a normative account in the sense that it prescribes steps of interpretation. On the contrary, faithful to his methodological option, Kelsen offers a description of what interpretation is, and that is very interesting to stress because he's been loyal to his methodological option. He's trying to describe the phenomenon of interpretation, of what happens when we interpret the law. And part of the core of my idea is to show that his theory of how interpretation is not a theory of interpretation but a theory about the interpretation of how interpretation is, a theory of the phenomenon of interpretation, is a little bit flawed, has this linguistic flaw. It doesn't handle the existence of stabilized meanings. And this is the reason I resort to Wittgenstein, as I've mentioned before. So to some extent, the idea of stabilized normative expectations in Luhmann's sense could briefly solve this problem. So the idea of law is to stabilize expectations, is to provide some possibility of expectations. So I use more or less in this sense the idea of stabilized meanings. So this was the flaw. And now to the second question: if we adjust this flaw, if we overcome the problem of stabilized meanings, I think that we could explain the idea of efficacy. I confess I don't really remember the question you've made about efficacy, but if I may build upon this point.
My question.
That, okay.
Why you talk about efficacy and not validity? That's the point.
Yes, because I think that is the theoretical device that could be highlighted if we correct this flaw, the idea of stabilized meanings. Efficacy as practices by people, efficacy as observance and application. So it is not something from the ought world, but from the is world. And the efficacy of a norm is only possible if we have a specific behavior extracted from a norm. And if this extraction is stabilized, if we are not changing it in a day-to-day situation, on a daily basis situation, we must have a stabilized meaning in order to talk of efficacy of this norm. Did I make myself clear? Yeah, you can talk, please.
A little comment, if I can. Just the definition of norm in Kelsen presupposes the stability of meaning in your terms. That is like the definition in Freie or rule. So I don't think that you can separate in terms of meaning between efficacy and validity.
No, we cannot. Efficacy is a condition of validity. No, efficacy is a condition of validity, you know, and I'm trying to fortify this idea. Efficacy is a condition of validity of a norm. This is what Kelsen says. The efficacy of a norm is a condition of validity. We can only talk of a validity of a norm and of a legal order if a norm and a legal order has this minimal of efficacy. But we could only talk of efficacy if we could talk of stabilized meanings. That is the point. I don't want to reject the idea of efficacy nor of validity. I want to fortify this notion by correcting what Kelsen said in his last chapter. That would be the idea. Did I make myself clear?
No, but I don't think that we can.
Here's something. It's not the efficacy of the legal order. It's not the efficacy of the individual norms. So the legal order has to be efficacious. So we can talk about validity, but it's not that the norm about homicide has to be efficacious because to have validity. So because they're going to be homicides and they're going to be like those cases that are not judged and so on and so on.
You know, Jorge, yeah, I do think that we should talk of efficacy as well as regarding individual norms, even homicide, because the norm that prohibits homicide has this minimal of efficacy. The problem is, so the principle is, the Kelsen stance is, it is a condition of validity, a minimum of efficacy. A norm, an individual norm, which has no efficacy, which is absolutely, which absolutely has no efficacy, is inefficacious. It's an invalid norm, you know? And that's why if we correct, again, if we correct what he says about interpretation, we could fortify this notion as well. But okay, I think we don't have time enough, and that would be interesting to discuss later. But I do think that efficacy as a condition of validity is worth as well as for individual norms.
Rubin, is this on point?
Yes. I'm not sure is the efficacy is the condition of validity, because if we have a huge problem with is and out problem, and you have confusion between is and out. I think that the presupposition of efficacy, it's the condition of validity, not efficacy. As well, the presupposition of the positive norm and the presupposition of efficacy is the question, and no efficacy, because we would have this problem of is and out problem. I don't know if you can understand what I'm saying.
Yes, the idea, the relation between efficacy and validity is one of the moments where Kelsen discusses the relation between is and out. And there is a very particular Kelsenian point, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure of this, that Kelsen argues that this is a very interesting point of contact between the is and out. The idea of a norm or a legal order which has no efficacy, which is inefficacious at all, erodes the idea of a legal order. So we could, for instance, we cannot presuppose a legal order which is not efficacy. It's not a presupposition. A legal order must has efficacy and in order to be valid. Otherwise, we could talk about completely Platonic idea of legal order, and that's not the case. A good norm must point at an efficacious legal order, a legal order which has a minimum of efficacy. That's the point. So that's the phrase. A minimum of efficacy is a condition of validity of a norm or a legal order.
Yeah, I think Professor Thomas Olechowski wants to say something on point.
Of course, now we have someone to discuss better
Yes.
than me, at least.
Just to this point, efficacy and validity, that's a big topic, of course, and I agree. That's a confusion of is and ought, and Kelsen was often had to quarrel about this. I only want to highlight the Robert Walter, who was the founder of the Hans Kelsen Institute, said this this confusion is also only a question of it makes sense. It only makes sense to look at legal orders who has a little efficacy. And it doesn't make sense. But if you want, you can say the Roman law is valid. It's possible to say it, but it doesn't make sense besides of the university, of course. So I think in Austria, we don't share this point of Kelsen today. I want only to highlight this.
Okay, very interesting. I don't know if we have time, sorry.
So I think Gonzalo want to say something. Gonzalo, no, Jorge Núñez, something.
Yeah, very briefly to follow Professor Lechowski's as well. I think, I'm going to combine it with Lars' presentation. He talked about intellectual game. And we have to bear in mind, Kelsen designed an intellectual game with rules. And I think it's a bit unfair to pick some of his rules and not others if we want to play the Kelsen's game. So coming back to Cristiano, I get your point about an individual norm, efficacy, and validity only if we talk about the dynamic view, according to Kelsen. But then if we go to the static, I can perfectly have a valid norm not being efficacious. So again, that would be seeing Kelsen as Kelsen, the dynamic and the static. And I think that was Professor Lechowski said. So yeah, I can agree and disagree with you, Cristiano, depending on which angle from Kelsen I take. Similar to Rubin, Kant. Yeah, he does follow Kant. I'm not quite sure about neo-Kantianism. But again, I think I'm going to use here Phil's presentation earlier today. Cherry pick. Yes, he defined his game, this fiction that Monika so clearly explains, because I think Monika describes the whole thing. It's a fiction, it's a fictional game, a fictional intellectual game. And he clearly cherry picks certain elements from Kant. I wouldn't claim to say he follows Kant because he doesn't. He follows certain traits like international relation or international law. He follows negative peace as Kant. Kant doesn't promise a holy land or we keep each other happy. He is trying to develop a negative peace in the sense, to avoid conflict or to put solution to conflict. Kant and Kelsen follows Kant in that sense of peace. That's why his contraction about international law, national law, and universal law. So yeah, I get your point. So I think we have to be mindful. If we want to play the Kelsenian game, the rules, whether we accept those rules or not. And if we don't accept, because we are not obliged to accept them, at least to be mindful and be very clear which rules we are not going to play within the game. Because if not, we seem to unfairly criticize Kelsen. And by no means this is a defense to Kelsen. It's just, trying to see this fiction as a whole. It has many intricate elements. So thank you very much.
Jorge, since you are there, can you please read your own question about fictionalism that was seconded by...
out of interest in Cristiano, because you were here, and this is just my, I have guilty pleasures here when I have, so many clever people. I guess you were here, when you pay attention to Monika's presentation. So it's I'm going to kind of push your buttons, and your gray cells here. What would you say about her take on fictionalism? Or if I had to rephrase, what would Vincent say about, Monika's presentation? I don't know if I'm being too unfair because I don't have the answer. But again, I'd like to throw you that question, Cristiano.
Okay, but we have time until, just to be...
We have 14 minutes, 4 o'clock. I mean, we can cut earlier, but we have 14 minutes until the break.
Okay, thank you, because I was very touched when you say that we Latin Americans tend to overtalk, and I truly agree with you. So I must control myself. So I really think that, in first place, I would make a comment to the comment, Professor Oleszowski, in a second. So first, answering you, seconding Zalewska, I don't think I have an answer. I don't think I have an answer on the point about Wittgenstein. So the idea of fictionalism, though, we could draw on Wittgenstein's work, especially his second phase, and to some extent the so-called third Wittgenstein. We could draw something on the idea of laws, on the ideas, on some ideas of philosophy of science. I don't think that we could find some relations between, or at least I don't know any specific relations between Wittgenstein and the idea of fictionalism from the point of view of Heidegger. There is a specific work on Wittgenstein which has been made by some of researchers around the world, which addresses the idea of perception. So there is this very famous picture, the rabbit and duck picture, the way we see things. So for instance, with this idea, Thomas elaborated his topic of paradigmatic revolution. He confesses that it was on one of his influences. So we could look at the same things, but seeing things differently. We could see things differently, looking at the same objects or looking at the same things. This is the idea of the duck-rabbit image. So we could look at a legal order and see it from the point of view of an international perspective or from a national perspective. This is the same thing as the legal, as the duck-rabbit picture. We're looking at the same drawing, but seeing a duck and a rabbit. And to some extent, the idea of fiction could be fit into this. So we could look at theories and trying to see things from a specific point of view, and eventually from a specific fiction. You know, this is to some extent, I think, what Monika conducted us. She conducted us to see how some points of Kelsen's theory could be better understood by seeing this as fictions or seeing this as some things, you know. And maybe at this point, the work of Wittgenstein on perceptions, we could find some relations with Heidegger, with the fictionalism Monika presented us. Now, I would like, so having time, I would like to make a comment on what Professor Oleszewski said. He said very interestingly that in Austria, we don't care too much about the relationship between efficacy and validity. But at least some works here in Brazil have been paying attention to it. And that's why I've mentioned Professor Neves in the last topic of my presentation, because according to Professor Neves, one of the main characteristics of symbolic constitutionalism is the fact that legal norms and constitutional norms are not concretized. They have not, in Kelsenian terms, efficacy, or they do not function as, or they do not provide stabilized expectations. And that is one of the problems of Latin American countries. We have a constitution which is used by some citizens, but for the whole book of citizenship, the constitution might not serve, because because at this level, we don't talk about constitution, because the constitution just does not apply to us, because people do not observe constitutionalism. So the idea of efficacy from a theoretical point of view is really relevant for those countries in which legal order just does not apply as it should be. That's the case of Latin America and the Brazilian case, and a lot of the cases of what I called in presentation, the peripheral modernity, you know. So the idea of efficacy should be explored from theoretical point of view when we are dealing with cases, we are dealing with countries in which constitutional norms are not so efficacious.
Thank you so much, Cristiano. And there are some comments in the chat that talk about the reality and the lack of efficacy in Latin America. So are there any other questions? Because I have two, but I would like to give the opportunity to other people to comment or question first. Gonzalo?
Can I say something small? I think that, Cristiano, do you think that perhaps they are playing different games, totally different games, Kelsen and Wittgenstein, and they're trying to demonstrate very different things? And try to combine, if I can say a metaphor, it's like I try to play Kelsen with Wittgensteinian dice. It can be very dangerous, I think.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. In the first place, Wittgenstein is one of the confessed examples by the founders of the logical positivism in the Circle of Vienna. So they say that they were following what Wittgenstein said in his Tractatus. But at least this conception of language I used to criticize Kelsen's account of interpretation is from the so-called second Wittgenstein, which criticizes to some extent the Wittgensteins of Tractatus. And so it's kind of difficult to compatibilize the philosophical background Kelsen had, which is to some extent the philosophical background of the Circle of Vienna, the Vienna Circle, and this latest Wittgenstein. So I wouldn't like to analyze or to assess Kelsen's account from the point of view of Wittgenstein's conception of whole conception of philosophy, but only in this specific point about what is meaning. Well, so what is the meaning of the words and how we interpret the words? And at this specific point, we could find similarities because Kelsen, as we agreed, I think, tried to provide a descriptive account of what the interpretation is. And in a specific point, Wittgenstein also tried to do the same thing. So how do we interpret things and how do we understand each other? And at this specific point, I think it might be fruitful to contrast both accounts. And this is a specific point which I addressed in my presentation, and that could even fortify other theoretical aspects of Kelsen's theory, such as the idea of affixes as condition of validity.
So we have had a wonderful discussion. I have two questions, one for Rubin and one for Cristiano. And I would like to use the metaphors that we have been using together to continue, the metaphor of game. So Kelsen, even he's not a Kantian or not, or how Kantian it is, he's playing within Kantian rules. So I think we all will agree that he's constructing a Kantian edifice. So, and many people in Latin America came to know Kant through Kelsen, which is something many lawyers do not read Kant, they read, and which is a funny thing. And you have suggested that Kelsen has this, to say, idiosyncratic understanding of Kant, to say at least, and the question is what would be the consequences for the Kelsenian building if he doesn't respect the rules of Kant, of the sort. And for similar reasons, I have a question for Cristiano, particularly on the idea of connecting the Kantian game with the practical turn. So the practical turn is this notion that it started with Wittgenstein and that we have to turn to social practices, right? And that's the key idea. And social practices are generally defined in terms of facts and pro-attitudes. So some people behave in a certain way, plus they have this mental status, and this is why money and everything exists. However, the Kelsenian game is departs from a separation between social facts and legal facts or practical facts. So if you take this separation between is and ought, between the factual and the normative seriously, there is an argument to be made that you cannot simply take the social fact, so the social ontology game, because that is a anti-Kelsenian game. The social ontology game departs from the idea that there is a sharp separation between facts and the social ontology game departs from the idea that you can start. So the social ontology game departs from the idea that you can bridge is and ought. That's Searle's point in 65. So yeah, those are my 2 points.
So
Rubin should talk.
Do you want to talk first? So thinking about the consequences of this, I don't know, that was not the objective of my work. I just show the problem and say that Kelsen has a problem with Kant and his interpretation. So I don't know what the consequence of this, but what I think that Kelsen is a pretty original author and a great jurist. And in fact, I think we just don't need Kant anymore. So just losing time to talking about Kelsen and Kant, because within the Kantians, this position of Kelsen is not serious. They not consider it as serious. In my opinion, Kelsen has a pretty good theory. In fact, he creates his own game, and sometimes he uses Kant or another authors to have a label of a philosophy or qualify his theory like something like better, but I don't know, I just don't need this. He's a great philosopher and he has his own game and just play with it, and I'm happy with this.
Do you want a reply?
So this is fair enough. So Kelsen create his own game. That's a fair point. Thank you.
Okay. So by the way, you say that we kind of agree that Kelsen play by Kant's rules, right? This is a point I'm struggling with. I do think that, and Professor Zalewska could build upon it. I do think that Kelsen plays by the rules of the logical positivism, of the Vienna circles. I think that he is more immersed in this debate than in a Kantian debate. I think that we should talk a little bit more. But hey, look at the footnotes of the first chapter of his Reinheitslehre, in which he announces his main methodological tenets. So he mentions George Edward Moore, Principia Ethica, Arthur N. Prior, Logic and the Basis of Ethics, Oxford, Ernst Mali, Grundgesetze des Wollens, Elemente der Logik des Willens, Graz, Alf Ross, Moritz Schlick, the founding father of the logical positivism, Alf Ross again, and Henry Zedwig, The Methods of Ethics. And that's it. So at least in Reinheitslehre, and there are the other chapters in which he mentions Alfred Ayer, a member of the Vienna Circle. He mentions Schlick again, and he mentions eventually Kant. Well, so I do think that he's more immersed in the debate of the positivism, of the logical positivism, than the Kantian debate. And if we assess his methodological tenets from the point of view of the logical positivism, we could find a lot of more similarities and even solutions to the problems appointed by Rubin. I don't know if Professor Zalewska had some comment on that. That would be even a question of mine. What do you think about this relationship, or how this relationship is more relevant than a neo-Kantism? We could talk even of a neo-Kantism in the Circle of Vienna, but I think that the Circle of Vienna has its own philosophical and methodological tenets. So please, Professor.
Yes, I don't agree. Kelsen was never part of the Vienna Circle, Moritz Schlick and so. He had very little contact, at least in his time in Vienna. Later in Geneva and so on, and in America, there were contacts in the movement of Unity of Sciences, but not in Vienna. And I think the first and most important, the Vienna Circle didn't accept Kelsen's distinction between is and ought. For a positivist, in a real positivist sense, there are only the facts, yeah? And there's nothing beside of that. Yeah? And so they called Kelsen a metaphysic, yeah? Which he denied, of course. Yeah. There was little context. There only one disciple of Kelsen named Kaufmann, who was part of both circles, but not more. And if you look, and that's my personal impression, from the 2 points of Kelsen, the distinction between Grundnorm and natural law on the one side, and the other side, the distinction is an ought. The is and ought was more important for him. It was not such a big problem for him to be put to natural law. Sometimes you say the Grundnorm, the basic norm, is just the little west of metaphysical in his legal theory. But the is and ought was the most important thing for him. So I don't agree. Sorry.
Well, I didn't say that, and I truly agree with you that Kelsen is not part of the Vienna Circle. But when he writes on these topics, he's always engaging with.
Okay, he was influenced. Of course, he read them. But in other way, they didn't accept him.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's the most important. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So,
and I think this is all so typical Kantian or neo-Kantian. But I would say the influence of neo-Kantianism of Kuhn is very evident.
Yeah. Okay. So that was very interesting. So please, Jorge. Jorge had something to say.
Very briefly, sorry. I know we have to go to a break, but very briefly, I love this. I have to agree again with the Professor Lechowski, not because I want to agree, but I have to agree. Rubin and Cristiano, what I said about different elements, and it's not Kelsen borrowed everything from Kant, he borrowed from Kant and many others. That doesn't mean that the structure is solid. That's what Professor Lechowski is trying to tell us as well. Yes, that's why it's not surprised that even in his circle, some people at the time didn't even follow or agree. So there are issues with that building because he's borrowing some elements to put, metaphors, because we are using metaphors right now, from Kant and from some others. But again, that doesn't mean there are certain issues when you mix different materials, to make them work. But again, that will take another Congress probably. So I'm going to let now Jorge Fabra share this last part. Thank you, Jorge.
Yeah, so we actually took more time than we have allocated. We have been in conference for more than 2 hours, and in this session, in discussion for almost 40 minutes. I think it's safe to stop at this moment, and so we can rest for a bit, and we are going to have the final keynote. I understand that we're going to have 1 hour at some time to meet after the fact. Those who still want to talk more about Kelsen, I want to continue this conversation, and maybe Gonzalo, Jorge, and I will select a couple of threads to have perhaps a more organized. And here's one: is whether you can connect Kelsen with social facts and be consistent. This is one I would bring to it. I would bring to the fore, and whether this Kelsenian game makes sense. And before I continue talking, it's the moment to stop. So we're going to stop